this has been great so far. When these three papers were first put on this brochure, I was wondering what would we have in common. And it seems like I think something that some of the things that Roland and Steve have both said will come to light in my presentation too. So I think this is going to be really good. So my presentation is on the Talented 20th, Entrepreneurship Agency in the Case of the Urban Minority Entrepreneur. For the purposes of this short presentation, I will use the African Americans specifically as a proxy for the urban minority entrepreneur. And it also makes sense because there's not appreciable differences if you control for being Hispanic, being ethnically Latino, or being Native American in the urban situation. Okay. So urban minority entrepreneurs are both, my argument is urban minority entrepreneurs are both a source for theory development and management and a source of inspiration for business owners. So the title, I use the Talented 20th, but it's actually a reference to a book that was published right here in Chicago in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, who's pictured here all the way on I guess you're right. And there was this huge conversation that's still alive today, which is, I mean, kind of one of his basic premises is like every race will be led by its most talented 10. And for Du Bois, that meant the intellectual talented 10, right? And he the first black to have a PhD from Harvard. I mean, like he was always setting that model. Where Booker T. Washington, who's the first gentleman here, always talked about communities moving forth and growing once they have established economic leadership and stability. And so part of the frame of the presentation that I'm giving here is dealing with this question of whether the economic or intellectual leadership is what's needed when we start talking about growth, economic growth and development within the minority urban situation. Okay? So the outline for today's presentation, the first thing I'll talk about is kind of the structural barriers of minority urban entrepreneurship. Most of that will be intuitive, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time laying out all the structures that, I mean, even in the last presentation we've already started talking about. Entrepreneurial bricolage is a method for surviving in penurious environments. That's really kind of the clutch theoretical piece here. Urban minority business owners as the quintessential entrepreneurs. There's something that I think about in studying and choosing these entrepreneurs as a subject for study that is going to tell us something more general about the phenomenon of entrepreneurship and maybe the scope of the research field. And then at the end I'll talk about streams of literature within entrepreneurship that I think that that I've been arguing that my research will connect to. All right, so we'll deal with structural barriers first. So there's 4 stories of struggle, and once again I think this actually maps on neatly to the last presentation here. So for the urban minority entrepreneur, one issue where there's a huge barrier is the human capital issue. And so within the scholarship on self-employment, first of all, African Americans in particular when you control for race have the lowest rate of self-employment, and it's between 4 and 5%, and that's where I get the talented 20th from. It's about 4 or 5%, and so there's been all sorts of arguments or all sorts of research trying to explain why is that rate so small. And the reason why that's curious is people think if you have barriers to financial capital, if you have barriers to social capital, if you have barriers to intellectual capital, then your self-employment rate should be higher. It's the old, if you're being discriminated against, then you'll go and start stuff on your own. And so it's actually been kind of a curious thing in the literature. And so the human capital conversation in the literature is, does your community, as we're looking at different ethnic communities, does your community actually have a tradition of entrepreneurship and self-employment? Right? And so it makes distinctions between, say, Koreans, which are at the highest rate, almost 38%, versus African Americans, which would be the lowest at 4.5% to 5%. Another major determinant on whether the self-employment rate is going to be high is the educational background, right? African Americans, because of a lot of this is based on the remnants of historical racism, are not, and the penalties of being in schools that are trapped in these same urban situations that are failing in all sorts of different ways, are not able to procure the kind of education that's shown itself to be important for successful business, not just business launch, but business maintenance and growth. Okay, So the intellectual, so there's a huge struggle there. Social capital. This is a big line now. Actually, one of the professors I work with at Darden, Greg Fairchild, has been working on the social capital piece, and really looking at how if you don't have the traditions of self-employment in your culture, right, and so you're not mingling, right, with other entrepreneurs and business owners, and if you're not in the schools and studying with the folks that are going off or traditionally gone off and started businesses, then your social network, your social capital is going to be fairly limited as far as what you can draw on to help you as ingredients, right, to foment entrepreneurship. And finally, one of the most obvious things is financial capital, whether it be redlining, whether it be, once again, credit worthiness. Do you even have banks in the areas that you're operating with? Do those banks even make loans? Like, there's all sorts of traditional issues for this population around access to financial capital. Let's see. So when I studied that story and when I heard that story, I came out of it differently than most of the people in the literature. Most of the people use the African American entrepreneur as the foil, right? Like, if the Koreans are great, if the Miami Cubans are great, right? Here's the folks you don't want to be, right? Like, that's generally the way the story goes. And I look at it, I'm like, wow, with all of these issues, it's amazing that there's even 4% that are self-employed. Like, I see it as a different kind of thing, right? So part of what I'm arguing today is I see the urban minority entrepreneurs are good, that there's a symbolic inversion that happens here, that what is normally looked at as being bad, I figured there might be some good that comes out of this. And there might be something special about those folks who are able to survive and even thrive in the worst situations possible, that really violate all the rules for self-employment, right? Like, you would never start a business where these folks are starting a business and maintaining a business, most of them family businesses, which is why I wanted to be on this panel today. So in light of all the cultural, social, and economic barriers, it's amazing that even 4 to 5% of blacks have businesses. Another piece, though, that explains my motivation for doing this or talking about this at an ethics conference comes from, so the major theorist that's important for me all the way through my dissertation, this is part of my dissertation research, is Claude Lévi-Strauss, pretty famous anthropologist who passed away last October. And a great work by Christopher Johnson goes to explaining kind of why anthropology was so important for him, and this will help to explain why anthropology then has become important for me in studying and thinking about the African American entrepreneur. And I just want to read a passage here where he talks about a special kind of humanism that Claude Lévi-Strauss advocated in relationship to anthropology. It says, the third humanism is the discipline of ethnology itself, which extends the study of humanity to cultures ignored by the traditional humanists. The task of ethnology is to provide an objective, external perspective on these societies, but also, through the practice of fieldwork, the ethnologist's participation in the everyday existence of a particular group, an internal perspective of their lived experience, their affective and mental life. Compared to its more scholarly predecessors, created for the privileged elites of privileged civilizations, ethnology is a more democratic form of humanism, in that it takes account of the most humble and most disregarded examples of human experience and existence. And so one of the things that I think is important in talking about this as an ethics an ethics conference, and maybe one of the moral imperatives of my research, is that I think also only looking at African Americans as a foil, I mean, whether it be in education, literature, business, it limits what we can then see about the goodness of these folks and what they're doing, right? And so I feel like following Claude Lévi-Strauss, if we want to find out something about the field of entrepreneurship, then maybe that's precisely where we're going to find it, is in the vanquished, right? Not the folks who have all of the goodies, but the folks who are making it happen, who don't.